It was one of those cold, dreary days when storm clouds hung heavy in the sky, as if drenched in ink. The darkest shades bled into their swollen underbellies, rippling with the silent promise of an impending storm. The streets lay eerily empty, like blank pages abandoned by a writer whose muse had fled, leaving behind nothing but silence and the weight of unfinished stories. As I wandered through a part of town I'd never explored before, a crooked sign caught my eye: Curiosities and Relics. I hesitated for a moment. I'd never noticed this little antique shop before. Something about it seemed both inviting and unsettling, like the door was waiting just for me. The shop was a treasure trove of curiosities, an eclectic mix of peculiar artifacts and forgotten relics. Shelves sagged under the weight of dusty old books, curious trinkets and oddities from distant lands. Taxidermy creatures with glassy eyes stood frozen in time, while antique jewelry and vintage clothing whispered stories of those who once wore them. Strange natural specimens floated in glass jars, old maps lay curled and yellowed with age, and decorative objects, both beautiful and bizarre, were scattered throughout. But among all these marvels, it was the inkwell that captured my attention, as if it had been waiting for me all along. It sat on a little pedestal at the back of the shop, nestled between a tarnished quill and a stack of yellowed parchment. The inkwell was antique Victorian, with intricate floral patterns imprinted into its brass lid, blackened by age. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that captivated me. It was the fact that the inkwell still had ink inside, a deep obsidian black that gleamed in the dim light like oil on water. "She calls to you, doesn't she?" I was startled by the sound of the voice and turned to see an old woman standing behind the counter. She appeared out of nowhere, as if she had stepped out of a shadow. Her dark eyes glinted with unsettling knowingness, and the colorful scarves she wore made her look more like a gypsy or a fortune teller than a shopkeeper. "It's beautiful," I murmured, wondering why she referred to an inanimate object as she. The old woman smiled, though there was something off about it, like someone smiling at an inside joke only they understood. "I knew you would think so, but be warned. That inkwell isn't just an antique, it's cursed." Her voice was soft but deliberate, as if the words were meant to weigh on me. I couldn't help but smirk. "Cursed? How so?" The woman's fingers traced the edge of the counter as she leaned forward. "This ink was first made by the oldest novelist in history, a Japanese noblewoman from centuries ago. She wasn't just a writer, but an artist of words. They say she used her own blood in the ink, channeling every bit of passion, fear, joy, and sorrow from the veins in her body into her work. She created her muse, an otherworldly source of inspiration that whispered stories into her mind. The ink was passed down from writer to writer," the old woman continued, "like a sacred relic. Each one was instructed by the muse to add their own blood, their own soul into the ink. Over time, the ink absorbed all the writer's ambitions, hopes, and madness. It changes the writer who uses it. At first, it gives you brilliance. Words will pour from you effortlessly, as if the stories were living creatures waiting to escape your pen. But the muse always demands more." Her eyes darkened, as though recalling something deeply personal. "Eventually, it drives you mad, just like it did with all the others. The ink consumes everything." Her words were eerie, but something in me, a dangerous curiosity maybe, couldn't let it go. "How much?" I asked, my voice firmer than I intended. The old woman's expression shifted. There was a flicker of pity? Or was it amusement? $50, she said. "A bargain if you're willing to pay the real price." Without another word, I reached into my wallet and handed her the cash. As she wrapped the inkwell in brown paper, she said, "Don't say I didn't warn you." That night, I sat at my desk, the inkwell faintly illuminated in the flickering candlelight. I dipped my pen into the ink, the liquid clinging to the nib like thick silk. The moment the ink touched the page, A flood of ideas rushed into my mind. Whole worlds unfolded before me. Characters with intricate backstories, plots so complex and beautiful I could hardly keep up. I wrote for hours, barely aware of time passing. Each word felt like pure genius, the best writing I'd ever done. My hand cramped, but I couldn't stop. It was like the ink had a mind of its own, guiding me through every sentence, every twist and turn. But when I finally set the pen down, something strange happened. I felt empty. Like every thought, every ounce of creativity I had was sucked out of me and poured onto the page. The next night, the itch to write returned, only stronger. It was as if the ink was calling to me, demanding to be used again. When I tried to resist, a voice whispered in the back of my mind. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Write. You must write. I ignored it at first, but the voice grew louder each day. It whispered to me when I tried to sleep, coaxing me, pleading with me. And when I finally gave in, dipping the pen back into the ink, the relief was intoxicating. Words poured from me in a feverish rush, faster and more brilliantly than before. But each time I wrote, it took more out of me. My hands began to tremble, and dark circles formed under my eyes. The voice grew bolder, no longer whispering but commanding. And then, one night, it told me to bleed. At first, I laughed it off as nonsense, but the longer I resisted, the more the voice gnawed at my sanity. In a haze of desperation, I pricked my finger and let a drop of blood fall into the ink. The black liquid swirled and glimmered as if it had just been awakened. From that moment on, the voice was no longer just a whisper in my mind. It was alive, a presence that coiled around my thoughts like a serpent. It whispered stories to me in my sleep, pulling me deeper and deeper into its world. Days bled into nights and nights into days. I barely ate or slept. My fingers were stained with ink in small cuts, each one feeding the inkwell little by little. But the more I wrote, the less control I had over my own mind. The stories were no longer mine. They belonged to the muse. I began to see things, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my room, characters from my stories appearing as if they were real. And the voice, it never stopped. More. Give me more. I tried to stop writing. I really did. But the ink wouldn't let me. It was inside me now, like a parasite feeding on my thoughts. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back. My eyes were hollow, my hands shaking from exhaustion and madness. And yet I knew that if I didn't write, the voice would consume me completely. I don't know how much time I have left. The ink is almost gone, and the voice is growing more desperate. It wants more blood. It wants everything. If you find this journal, please, don't use the inkwell, burn it, destroy it. Whatever you do, don't write. Because once you dip your pen into that ink, it's already too late.